Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. You know, in photography, you keep hearing all the time that you should be shooting in RAW. What's the real story here? Should you indeed be shooting in RAW, or is this a myth? Or, for example, do you know someone who's tried to shoot in RAW and they said they liked their JPEGs better? I'll actually explain why. In this video, I'm going to clear any confusion you may have between RAW and JPEG and why for some people, times may have changed. And you don't want to miss when I explain how the new kid on the block, compressed RAW, fits into the equation. My name is Simon d'Entremont and I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. First off, a warning, there are people in the comments below pretending to be me and using my photo, offering you prizes. These are scammers. It'll help if you report them, as I have been. So let's start off by getting our definitions and technical stuff straight. A RAW file is the original information captured by your sensor, uncompressed and unprocessed. By uncompressed, I mean that nothing's been done to the file to squish it into a smaller form factor. By unprocessed, I mean that there have been no changes to the photo to make it prettier. It's sent to your memory card and stored there in its digital format with nothing done to it. Some people refer to this as your digital negative. Because nothing's been done to it, all the data originally captured is still available, which makes for large file sizes. Now, when you try to open it in your computer, it needs to be decoded or converted to a format your computer can easily see and display. I use Adobe Lightroom, which does this step for me. On the other hand, a JPEG is a compressed and processed version of what your camera captured. By that I mean that the photo has had some beauty adjustments made to it to look prettier. Maybe contrast, saturation, some sharpening, or some noise reduction. That's why you hear people say, I tried shooting in RAW, but my JPEGs looked better. It's because the JPEG has been made prettier, but the RAW is still in its original state. You may be asking, what changes are made to the photo, and can I control it? You sure can. The changes made to your file to turn your RAW into a JPEG in camera are controlled in your camera menu. It's called Picture Styles in Canon, Nikon calls them Picture Control, on Fuji it's Film Simulation, and Sony it's Picture Profile. This menu allows you to adjust the JPEG to taste depending on your style. Landscape mode gives you richer greens and blues. Portrait mode doesn't add as much sharpening for softer skin tones, for example. You can even design your own. An important thing to remember here is that the settings only affect the JPEG, not the RAW file. But interestingly, the photo showing on the back of your LCD is not the RAW. Even when you shoot in RAW, it's a JPEG made to show on the screen. So yes, the picture profile affects the LCD image as well. In JPEG, compression has also been applied to the file to make the file smaller. Now, compression by itself is not really the problem. Some compression can be done without losing much information. For example, in this photo, I made the background intentionally white. With a RAW, the camera will store every pixel individually. So white, 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 white on a pixel by pixel basis. For compressed files like JPEG, the camera will rather say, this section here is pure white, so record this section as white. Much simpler and much less data needed. But let's give JPEG its due. It's not just a simple shrinking of the file and not counting duplicate colors twice. It's a sophisticated mathematical algorithm combined with the results of visual and psychology studies and models. These take into account which colors and brightnesses our eyes perceive more and less, the fact that changes to blurry out of focus parts of the image are less noticeable, and the fact that our eyes are more sensitive to changes in brightness than changes in colors, and a host of other very smart tools based on how our eyes and brain actually work. Let's look at some of the differences between the two formats. So while compression can be lossless, most compression does indeed throw some data away to make the files smaller. In many cases, compressed photos have a lower bit depth. That is, they can describe fewer colors. When using the mechanical shutter, my Canon R5 shoots in 14-bit RAW. That's 4 trillion colors. RAW files in my 45 megapixel camera are around 53 megabytes. But the same photo shot in JPEG is only 14 megabytes. That's because JPEG is 8-bit, which can handle 16 million colors, quite a bit less. Where does this difference show up? Often it's in the gradients of similar color. To go from light to dark in any one color requires many different shades of this color at the pixel level, often requiring just the smallest of changes pixel to pixel. When your file doesn't have enough colors available, these gradients can start looking streaky or blocky. Let me exaggerate this so you can see what I mean. Here I'm in Photoshop and I've created a gradient in blue from light to dark. In 8-bit mode, the same as a JPEG, if I squish this file together using levels to reduce the number of available tones, and then I stretch the file back out, you'll see that these nasty gradients appear. That's because the squishing and stretching of the file that's only 8-bit shows off that there aren't enough colors to visually represent the entire image. On the other hand, if I do exactly the same procedure with a 16-bit file, the resulting gradient comes out as smooth as the original. I've exaggerated the effect here, but I wanted to show you visually what we're talking about. But that's a theoretical. Let's look at a real photo instead. Here are two photos shot in RAW and JPEG. I intentionally shot a photo with some bright highlights to illustrate a point. As you can see, the JPEG actually looks very nice, if not better, right out of the camera at full screen. Why? Because it's had some processing applied to it to make it look better. A bit of noise reduction and added saturation. It's also maybe a bit darker, maybe to hide those noisier dark areas. But the whites in this image are pretty bright. If I lower the highlights in both photos, you can see that in the RAW file I can recover some detail from the whites, whereas on the JPEG, lowering the whites just produces a featureless gray tone, which isn't very attractive. If we look at these dark images, like photos of my network attached storage device, you can see that again at full screen with no changes, the JPEG looks fine. But if we boost the darks 3 or 4 stops, the JPEG starts getting a greenish cast and a lack of detail. So the benefit of the RAW is that I could still continue to process the photo and get better results than the JPEG, both in recovering highlights and deep shadows. That being said, I have to hand it to the JPEG. If I was only raising the shadows 1 or 2 stops, the JPEG is holding up very, very well and is usable in many applications. I think that modern sensors with better dynamic range are making JPEGs better than ever by making more tones available and making it less likely to blow out the whites and crush the blacks. Another element that separates RAW from JPEG is white balance. When you shoot in RAW, your white balance is adjustable in processing without penalty. If the image is too warm or too cool or the tint is off, you can adjust these afterwards. In JPEG, these are much more difficult to adjust without affecting the whole image, often in ways that aren't very helpful. Here's a photo shot in RAW, but with the wrong white balance setting. All I need to do here in Lightroom is click here and voila, all fixed in one step. As we saw earlier, RAW files are much larger than their JPEG counterparts. If you take lots of photos and want to store them, the cost of shooting RAW needs to be considered. I have several terabytes of photos stored as part of my work. For each photo, I use the best practice of having 3 copies, 2 locally and 1 in the cloud. So I have several terabytes of RAW photos stored on a hard drive. I have a redundant copy of that drive and a storage subscription service to store it all off-site. If I was shooting and storing JPEG, my cost would be about a quarter of my current cost, saving me hundreds if not $1,000 or $2 every year. Another difference between these two file types is how it affects your ability to shoot many frames per second. Because of the large file sizes of RAW files, it takes longer for your camera to write them to the card. As such, your camera may start to bog down and start to stutter when shooting in RAW, which sounds like this. But the smaller file size of JPEG can keep your camera shooting longer and faster without bogging down. Maybe you shoot long action sequences at sporting events, and in RAW, your camera seems to never get to the end of the sequence without starting to bog down, also called buffering. If the other issues about shooting in JPEG aren't deal breakers, then switching to JPEG will allow you to get more exposures in a long sequence. Another variable that makes RAWs and JPEGs different is how quickly you need to access and use your photos, as well as how universally they can be used by various devices. The advantage of JPEG is they come straight out of the camera looking more polished and ready to go, and can be used by almost any device. Let's say you're at an event where the photos are needed right away, and having a laptop is an issue. Let's say that you're riding in a hot air balloon and you want to take a picture and post it somewhere in real time. In that case, sending that photo straight to your phone, which many cameras can do now, to send to someone else or to post right away might be better done as a JPEG than as a RAW. Or maybe you're a photographer at a road race and you're at turn 7 and the sports news organization wants live updates and photos during the race. If you need to shoot and send them quickly, JPEG may be what you should use. Also, another benefit, JPEGs are universal. You can send one and anyone can open it on their phone, send it to a friend's phone, put it on a TV to watch it, or open it on any PC. Not always the case with RAW files. So before we go on to my bonus section, let's quickly review where we're at. You should shoot in RAW if your priority is having the best dynamic range, you want more post-processing flexibility, you want the ultimate image quality and color fidelity. Memory and storage are not a problem, you have access to a program that can convert your RAW files, or your workflow permits it. You may want to shoot in JPEG when speed and simplicity of workflow is important. Getting that photo out quickly is a priority. You want to simplify image processing or don't have a RAW converter on your PC. Ultimate image quality is not critical. You want to use less memory and storage, or your camera is faster shooting in JPEG for fast action. I'm sure there are other reasons for each choice that I haven't covered. Let us know in the comments below what you shoot and why you do. So, is JPEG's second-rate reputation deserved? Less and less so all the time. There are plenty of perfectly good reasons why it's okay for photographers to shoot JPEG, and even pro applications too, where speed of workflow is a priority. If you do decide to shoot JPEG, make sure you're using the picture profile that's flattering to your style of photography, or make your own. Get the white balance right in camera, and be careful with under and overexposure, as they're harder to fix with JPEG. One way you can have the best of both worlds is to shoot both RAW and JPEG at the same time. While this does use more memory, if you have situations where having both or having a backup is a handy situation, go for it. Maybe you do professional work. One can be JPEG for posting quickly online, and the RAW can be used to make a print or if you get the magazine cover. Also, I said I'd raise a third format, and that's compressed RAW. What's that, you may ask? Compressed RAW is a type of format that we're seeing more and more, where the original photo dimensions are kept and the photo is unprocessed, but the file is compressed. These files end up being smaller than the original RAW, but larger than a JPEG. Compared to my earlier examples of RAW being 53 megabytes and JPEG 14 megabytes, the compressed RAW is in the middle-ish at 30 megabytes. They may also be at a lower bit rate than the original RAW. Different cameras implement these in-between formats differently. On some cameras like Nikon, you can set the camera to shoot at 12-bit rather than 14-bit. On Sony, you can set the RAW to compressed and you'll get 13-bit files. On Canon, you can choose C-RAW for a compressed RAW, or if you shoot in electronic shutter mode, you get 12-bit files. The question is, can we tell the difference between RAW and compressed RAW or these lower bitrate files? How do they stand up? If we look at these photos comparing compressed RAW and RAW from my Canon R5, and if I look at the brightest whites and the darkest darks, when I try to recover highlights and shadows, and I'm looking with a huge magnification factor here, I can barely tell the difference. The bright whites look close to identical, and the shadows need to be pushed 4 or 5 stops to see the difference. And even then, only with a huge magnification factor. It's so subtle, most people would never notice. In most cases, if you're not cropping, or trying to pull out the finest dynamic range out of the shadows and highlights, or doing very fine retouching, compressed RAW will work just as well as an uncompressed RAW. And is compressed RAW a viable alternative to RAW even for the most fussy pixel peeper? I think it is for many. So in the end, with my style and genre of photography, and with what I do, I shoot RAW all the time. I crop a lot, I process my files diligently for printing, and often shoot in dark or challenging environments. As such, I'm often pushing the envelope for image quality. My camera can still shoot tons of exposures quickly, and I have large on-site storage for storing large files, and I have a powerful computer to process them. It works for me and gives me top-notch results. But if I was on safari miles from my home base, and the action was so good that I only have enough memory card space to take another 100 RAW photos, and could stretch that out to 250 photos with compressed RAW, or 500 photos by switching to JPEG, would I do it? Absolutely, in a heartbeat. Photos that are 96 or 98% of what a RAW offers are still better than no photos, and in many applications, it wouldn't be noticeable. We discussed in this video how shooting in JPEG can actually work well, but that you really need to get the exposure right. The best tool to do that is learning how to use a histogram. If you want to see my video on that, click here. Remember, none of these choices will make you a better photographer per se. That comes from going out there and developing and honing your skills. I hope you go out there and take some amazing photos, whichever format you shoot in. I know you can do it.